Okay, let's start. On behalf of the Center for Chinese Studies at UH Manoa, I'd like to welcome everyone to our Spring 2023 CCS webinar series. My name is Mingbao Yu from the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures, where I teach 20th century literature, film, and culture. And I'm currently also serving as the CCS director and the organizer of this year's webinar series, with the kind assistance of CCS Executive Committee and CCS Associate Director Ren Youmei, Dr. Cindy Ning. Please note that today's session is being recorded and the file will be uploaded to our CCS YouTube channel, where you will also find previously recorded CCS webinar sessions. Our full program flyer for this semester can be found on the CCS website and Instagram, and you can see the links to all three media platforms now in the chat forum. Today's session is also co-sponsored by the History and EAL departments here at UH Manoa, and we would like to thank and acknowledge them for their support. Before I introduce today's featured speaker and panelists, allow me to quickly go over some procedural reminders. Please feel free to use the chat forum for posting any technical or other queries, but use the Q&A tool for posting comments and questions to our speakers, which will be answered during the Q&A session. We kindly ask that you please keep your comments concise and ask no more than 2 questions so that we can accommodate everyone and keep within the 30 minutes we have allocated to the Q&A session. We will try to take the questions in the order they have been submitted, but might also synthesize or group together similar questions so that we save time and make room for other comments and query. We further reserve the right to dismiss comments and questions that are not relevant or civil in tone. After today's session, you'll receive a brief survey, and we would greatly appreciate your constructive feedback. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce our 3 distinguished speakers in today's book talk and interdisciplinary panel featuring Dr. Dongfeng Xu's book entitled Friendship and Hospitality, the Jesuit-Confucian Encounter in Late Ming China, published in the Chinese Philosophy and Culture series by SUNY Press 2022. Since the book's publication last year, Dr. Xu has been on a virtual book tour across the country because the book has received a lot of attention. Dr. Xu studied in China, Canada, and the United States, and he has taught and worked at various institutions in Asia and North America. From 2013 to 14, he was actually a visiting assistant professor of Chinese at the EAL department here at UH Manoa. So it is a particular pleasure to welcome him back, albeit virtually, to talk with us about his new book. Dr. Xu is currently an assistant professor of Chinese at Colgate University, and his research interest is pre-modern religion and literature. In addition to his book, he has written about Chinese poetry and narrative fiction. His articles include Home as Metaphor in Su Shi's Song Lyrics, or Other Rhetorics, Reading Matteo Ricci's A Treatise of Friendship, and On the Journey of the West. We are also very fortunate today to have 2 respondents engaging Dr. Xu in a discussion and conversation. Our first respondent will be Dr. Yiqun Zhou from Stanford University's East Asian Languages and Culture Department. Trained as a comparatist, Dr. Zhou is currently an associate professor whose major research interests are the comparative study of antiquity, Chinese family history, Ming-Qing fiction, and the reception of classical traditions in modern China. She has published numerous articles and book chapters, most recently in these 2 anthologies, Gender and Status Competition in Pre-Modern Society, 2022, and Emotions Across Cultures, Ancient China and Greece, also 2022. Dr. Zhou's forthcoming book, 无密的精神世界, 无密 and an intellectual and spiritual portrait, is written in Chinese and will be published this spring by Beijing's commercial press, 商务印书馆. Our second respondent is Wensheng, Dr. Wensheng Wang from UH Manoa's History Department, where he is a professor of later Imperial China, specializing in 18th and 19th centuries. His research interests include empire building, cultural politics, intellectual change, social movements, popular religion, maritime interactions, and foreign relations. Dr. Wang is the author of the book White Lotus and the South China Pirates, Crises and Reform in the Qing Empire, published by Harvard University Press in 2014. He's currently working on a second book project on the transformative power of Confucian ideology and its interactions with the Qing state before Opium War. We will first invite Dr. Xu to give a presentation about 20 to 30 minutes on his new monograph, and then invite each respondent to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a dialogue between them before we open the floor to comments and questions from the audience. So without further ado, allow me to turn over to Dr. Dongfeng Xu.
Thank you very much, Ming-Bao, for the generous and very kind introduction. And I thank you to organize this and thank Cindy and Yiqun and Wensheng to be here to spend time to talk about my work. And I feel very, very much at home to be at UH again, even just virtually, and because I have fond memories of the time I spent there. And so without saying, well, I'll have a chance to say more about my gratitude. But now let's just talk about what I did in my book, part of it, because I know our time is limited and I would like to leave as much time as possible to Professor Zhou and Professor Wang for what I know to be their incisive commentaries on my book, and to the Q&A session at the end, which we will learn a great deal from everybody here. And I thank everybody to be here, to take time off. This is a busy time of the year. So without saying other things, I will go into my discussion, my presentation of my book. I will say it as quickly as possible, and so that we don't take too much time here. And in the book, I try to address the exchanges between the Jesuit missionary and their Confucian host in late Ming China during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Jesuit mission to China is by no means a new topic. The Jesuit influence on the history of China-West relationship has been a subject of sustained scholarly investigation. Through the years, generations of scholars worldwide have devoted their time and effort to advance the understanding of the religious, historical, culture, literary, and scientific significance of this cross-culture and interreligious encounter between the Jesuits and the Chinese. So in my book, I chose to study this China-West encounter by examining friendship and hospitality, because during the exchanges and the interaction between the Jesuits and the Confucians, both friendship and hospitality were discussed and practiced, while the Jesuits promote Western ideas of friendship as they sought to befriend the Chinese, especially the Confucian scholars. The Confucians displayed their hospitality in various ways as their responses to these Jesuit strangers from the West. And as I said, I want to leave as much time as possible to the question period and also to Professor Zhou and Professor Wang. I will only talk about the chapter in which I discussed Ritchie's writing, Ritchie's work, 交友论, or a treaty on friendship. This is chapter 2. This is chapter 2 of my book. So Ritchie's a treaty on friendship. Hereafter, I'll call it on friendship, was written in classical Chinese to introduce to the Chinese audience the Western concept of friendship. First published in 1595, the book contained 100 aphorisms, which Ricci drew mainly, if not solely, from source books such as Sententia et Exempla. Given the missionary nature of the Jesuit order and the Jesuit guideline that all Jesuit members must do, I quote, everything for the greater glory of God, end of quote, we can say that Ricci's book was meant to be an integral part of his mission, which aimed at, in the words of one Jesuit scholar, I quote, to naturalize Christianity in Chinese setting, end of quote. In other words, Ricci took his mission to China to convert the Chinese to Christianity. It is from this perspective I examine this work by Ricci, and I argue that Ricci's understanding and the interpretation of friendship aimed at not only erasing differences between the self and the other of friends, but also assimilating China according to what can be in the main called Western metaphysics of identity. In my discussion, because I treat friendship as a concept concerning alterity in a Derridian deconstructive fashion, I look into some examples from unfriendship and argue that difference or other is the absolute condition of possibility under which friendship happens. Though Ricci in his preface to On Friendship seemed to show his awareness of and his respect for difference between friends, he made no effort in his attempt to appropriate difference. He made no effort to hide his attempt to appropriate difference in his book. To show what Ricci wanted to do, the two opening aphorisms in the book provide good examples. The first aphorism was taken from St. Augustine's Confessions. It reads, I quote, "My friend is no other but half of my very self. That is, a friend is the second me. One should therefore regard a friend as oneself," end of quote. The second aphorism is traditionally attributed to Aristotle. It goes like this, I quote, "A friend and I exist as two bodies, but within these two bodies, there is only one soul," end of quote. By the way, this aphorism from Aristotle has a more concise and more famous translation in English. It reads, "One soul embodies twin." That's how Aristotle supposedly described friendship. One soul embodies twin. It should be clear that both aphorisms share a desire to reconcile oppositions and differences through a movement of thought that would finally reduce them to as respects of a single comprehensive vision. They either reduce a friend to be a second self of another friend, or have friends abandon their fundamental disparities by having themselves united by one and the same soul. Following the tone he set up for his book and his friendship and the friendship that he saw to unite friends with one soul, Ricci had some similar sayings in On Friendship to show what he saw to be the soul that could unite friends. here are 4 aphorisms Ricci quoted. First, I quote, the duty of a friend is to do what is ordained by righteousness. End of quote. Second saying, it is only by the same virtue that the same resolution that friendship can be maintained. End of quote. Third saying, the everlasting virtue is the excellent bait of an everlasting friendship. Last quote, the friends who share more diversion than they do righteousness in their relationship will not be friends for long. End of quote. So as we can see, the terms righteousness, yi, and virtue, de, which Ricci asserted to be the morals and principles determining friendship, happen to be the ideas and concepts which the Chinese readers were extremely familiar with and would frequently encounter in their reading of Confucian classics. With these terms appearing in his Chinese translation of aphorisms about Western friendship, what Ricci hoped to convey here may be more than a view that the Western understanding of mores was not too different from that of the Confucians. What he seemed to be saying could also be that since the same righteousness and virtues were the determining factors or synonyms of the soul of the soul of friendship, same righteousness, same China and the West should be ideal or perfect friends in Aristotelian sense. In other words, Aristotelian, the saying, one soul in body's twin, should be extended to mean one soul in culture's twin. Given Ricci's mission to China, to have one soul uniting both the Western culture and Chinese culture must have been what he worked for and what he would love to see. However, as we read through on friendship, a problem gradually emerges. We become uncertain if Ricci was successful even in presenting the friendship culture of the West as one. Because in his book, he quoted both pagan authors and Christian authors. As a result, the readers read sayings by pagan authors like Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca, Marshall, etc., and also sayings from Christian authors like St. Augustine, Cassiodorus, Erasmus, Pope Gregory I, and others. Some may not see this mixture a problem for Ricci and his book. They may even say that Ricci's inclusion of authors of different faiths and cultural backgrounds helped him cover more completely different ideas of friendship in the West. Nobody can call this view wrong. However, I must point out that Ricci's quoting Christian authors in his book, even his inserting occasionally the term or name of God in the couple of the sayings in the book, did not give a more comprehensive picture of various forms of friendship in the Western world. In fact, I would say that his book did not even present to the Chinese reader the kind of Western friendship called Christian friendship or Christian charity. Saying this, I have two reasons. One is Ritchie's use of God. Let's look at an example where Ritchie inserted God's name. It is an aphorism from Cicero, which goes like this, I quote, "An individual is unable to do everything to perfection. Therefore, the Lord on high, or God, decreed that people should make friends in order to help each other. If this world is deprived of friendship, mankind will undoubtedly disintegrate into ruin." End of quote. Cicero's original does not have the term or word or name of God there. Even if somehow Cicero had used the name of God in this quote, it could not have been the Christian God, because as we know, Cicero lived before the formation of Christianity. Therefore, the God Cicero would have talked about could not have been the God Ritchie believed in. But this is not the convincing reason for us to say that On Friendship did not present Christian friendship. My reason too is that the friendship presented in Ritchie's book is largely a pagan friendship. It is the kind of friendship pagans understood and practiced. I will explain. Because most of the authors Ritchie quoted were pagan authors, the friendship they talked about is the friendship for a few people. That is, for pagan authors, only people who are wise and virtuous can be good friends and have good friends. On friendship, this is the view we often see. For one example, for a few examples, the first one, I quote, "If one has many intimate friends, then one has no intimate friends." End of quote. Another one, "Even the wise tends to miscalculate their friends, assuming to have more friends than they actually do." Another one, I quote, "The value of a friendship lies in the intention of those who make it. In this day and age, how many out there befriend others strictly for others' virtue?" Or last one, quote, what are friends? They take long to find. They are few to have, hard to keep. Once they are out of sight, they come to their friend's mind." End of quote. The examples given here, like many in Ritchie's book, stress the view that friendship is the relationship between a few people, not for a large crowd of people. In fact, that friendship is only for a few good men or good people is a point repeatedly discussed in Cicero by Cicero in various of his works. And Cicero, through his sayings, appear in total 13 times on friendship, which makes him the most quoted author there. As for pagan friendship, we know it is drastically different from Christian fellowship or charity, which calls for a companionship of all humans with God. Here is what Christian author has to say about Christian friendship. I quote, "When Christians conform their friendship to the spirit of love, boundaries are broken, fears disappear, magnanimity reigns. In short, their friendship is preferential, but not exclusive, for they welcome others to the way of life through which they will find their fullness in God. Through the preferential love of their friendship on earth, rooted as it is in Christ, they learn to prefer God, what God does, the perfect community of all being one in God." So Christian friendship, as the last sentence has here asserts, is, I quote, "a perfect community of all being one in God." End of quote. In Ritchie's book, what is missing from the friendship discussed is exactly this community of all. Even the Christian authors he quoted seem to only have sayings with which they talk about how a few good friends help each other cultivate their virtues. In short, the friendship in Ritchie's book is an exclusive human affair, which is completely different from the Christian view of friendship that concerns the union between God and all humans. So different factors might have compelled Ritchie to write his book, to make his book one of pagan friendship. As I see it, the first factor may be because Ritchie's evangelical work in China was undertaken only indirectly, with most of the fundamental Christian concepts remaining unknown to the Chinese. It would not have been productive if most of the Chinese reader of On Friendship did not get the Christian message. For the second and also more important factor, in a country, in China, a country where xenophobia was strong at the time, Ritchie adopted a commendation policy. When it came to write about friendship for the Chinese for better reception, it was obvious that he should present pagan friendship, whose idea of friendship not being for a large group of people would go well with the Confucian idea of friendship being a highly selective relationship. Here, we can remind us of what Confucius said about friendship. He says, I quote, "He stands to benefit who befriends three types of people, and he stands to lose who befriends three types of people. 益者三友，损者三友, right? And given what three types of people, given what we see in friendship, it is its presentation of pagan friendship, not Christian friendship, Ritchie's intention to appropriate differences between the Chinese and the Christians cannot be called successful. When he tried to erase difference and otherness, he had at the same time acknowledged the greatest difference of the Chinese or Confucian host by making his presentation of Western friendship a partial one and leaving out virtually completely the friendship, the God-human companionship that was most important to him. Here, just to conclude my discussion of Ritchie's on friendship, I would say the following quickly. From a deconstructive perspective, the fact that Ritchie had to make his proselytization indirect and oblique to the extent that he ended up presenting and promoting the pagan view or virtue of friendship as compatible or at least familiar and thus acceptable to the Confucian readers can be seen as what Derrida and Emmanuel Levinas have called to be, I quote, the passive and unconscious decision, end of quote, referring to decisions of this kind as the other's decision in me. Simon Chrisley points out, I quote, the decision is not something taken by a subject, but rather the subject, insofar as one can still employ this word post-deconstructively, is taken by the decision that is made without its volition. End of quote. In his volition, in this sense, the moment of decision is a subject's relation to an alterity within himself. This is the end of the quote. In his work, Derrida would take the matter further. In his appeal to Emmanuel Levinas, he argues that that decision, like responsibility, is always of the other. I think I'll just stop here. I have used quite some time, I think, and I promised I would use less, but I went over the limit. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dongfeng. Okay, now we will invite Dr. Zhou to come and give her response.
So much has been written about the Jesuit mission in late Ming China, which can be regarded as the first chapter in the interaction between China and Europe in the early modern period, and left many far-reaching implications for the relations between the two cultures in modern times. Dongfeng's book stands out in the voluminous publications on this subject, in that it examines the meaning of the Jesuit-Confucian encounter under the auspices of the theories of Levinas and Derrida, two of the most provocative and influential thinkers in the history of philosophy of friendship. Friendship construed as an amicable relationship between self and other. A historically grounded application of Levinas and Derrida's abstractions and pronouncements about friendship and hospitality, Dongfeng's book provides a stimulating way to reapproach the mindsets and actions during the engagements, or lack thereof, between the Jesuits and the Confucians at the turn of the 17th century. Just as Levinas and Derrida's theories of friendship and hospitality were ethical responses to the many problems of the conflict-ridden 20th century, Dongfeng's book seems to be fundamentally motivated by a keen concern with the lasting legacy of the Jesuit-Confucian encounter over 4 centuries ago. In contrast to the emphasis on sameness and free choice in traditional Western views of friendship and hospitality, Levinas and Derrida advocate difference and unconditional openness. Levinas speaks of letting the stranger in, looking the stranger in the face and allowing it to shake you to the core and transform you. Instead of endeavors to find sameness and to assimilate the other, it is the acceptance and maintenance of difference that keep the friendship healthy and productive. Conditional hospitality receives Derrida's criticism as follows. I quote from Dongfeng's book, page 102. The other is welcome to the extent that he adjusts to the home, that he speaks the language, or that he learns the language, that he respects the order of the house, the order of the nation state, and so on and so forth, end quote. For Derrida, true hospitality has to abandon all these traditional conditions of hospitality. Against this philosophical backdrop, the actors in the Jesuit-Confucian encounter fall into their places in Dongfeng's book. On the one hand, there are those who embrace difference and allow themselves to be changed by the stranger. First of all, there is Matteo Ricci, the single most important figure from the Jesuit side, who promoted an accommodationist approach to proselytizing. Ricci took the plunge and adapted to the radical otherness of Chinese culture. As discussed in great detail in Dongfeng's book, that Ricci dressed up like a Confucian, took a Chinese name, attended ceremonies administered by Chinese clergy, and in Jiao You Lun on friendship, a collection of Western aphorisms about friendship that earned him recognition and respect among the Confucian literati, Ricci presents views of friendship that are largely classical and pagan and hotly Christian. In short, Ricci boldly opened himself up and readily sought conciliation with his Confucian associates. He did this to the end of his life, despite his disappointment and frustration over the lack of success in his religious mission. To Ricci, Dongfeng shows unmistakable appreciation. I quote, "The many acts of bravery and the many deeds of endangering his Jesuit identity, it seems, speak of a true faith in friendship, a faith that takes one to do the impossible for the friend who is none other than the holy other," end quote. Also belonging to the group who welcome difference and open themselves up to the stranger are the small number of Confucian converts to Christianity. Faced with the vast difference between Chinese and Western cultures, these converts, I quote from Dongfeng's book again, these converts believed that what must happen next was not that the strangers should identify themselves with the Confucian values. On the contrary, it was the Chinese or Confucians who needed to open up to the strangers. They had to do so not only to welcome and accept the strangers' new science, technology, and knowledge in various fields, but also to understand and even accept their new values, ideologies, and faith, end quote. In contrast to Ricci and the Confucian converts, are those who look at the stranger with suspicion and fear and attempt either to assimilate the stranger or not to have anything to do with the stranger at all. In the long term, this kind of insistence on the purity, sufficiency, and superiority of self and a failure to open oneself up to the difference of the other would eventually lead to the end of the Jesuit mission in China. 3 such groups are featured in Dongfeng's book. First, there are the Jesuit successors to Ricci after his death. They did not share Ricci's faith in friendship, and they were no longer willing to defer to the irreducible other at the expense of their own religious mission. The subsequent hardening of attitude on the part of non-Jesuit missionaries and the papal court is well known. Dongfeng actually does not dwell too much on these forces in his book. Then there are the anti-Christian Confucians, who are discussed extensively in Dongfeng's book, seeing that, I quote, "the equality promised in the Christian kinship would radically upset the Chinese social and political order by destroying at least 4 of the 5 cardinal relationships," end quote. These anti-Christian Confucians regarded the missionaries as a threat, a fundamental threat, and wanted them to be gone. Dongfeng does manage to find some good things to say about this group. For example, Dongfeng points out that in comparison with previous xenophobic rhetoric in Chinese history, such as Han Yu's polemic against Buddhism, these hotline Ming Confucian critics of Christianity clearly took the trouble to familiarize themselves with Jesuit writings. Notably and interestingly, Dongfeng has his harshest words for the third group, i.e. Confucians who practiced what he calls limited hospitality. They had interest in the superior science and technology brought by the missionaries, but seeing Christianity as a threat to the fundamental social and political structures and values of Chinese society, they resorted to what was a precursor to the Chinese substance Western function 中体西用 theory, famous in the late 19th century. According to Dongfeng, quote, this theory aims at justifying and legitimizing substances or the self's use and abuse for its own gain of the function or the other as a mere tool, a insignificant inferior, a absolute non-self, without the self running the slightest risk or sustaining the smallest sacrifice or even bearing the faintest sense of responsibility. Fiery and eloquent reproach indeed. At the same time, however, Dongfeng points out that the intriguing thing is that given the persuasive power of the substance and function theory, even a prominent Confucian convert like Xu Guangqi resorted to it sometimes. I hope I'm not too wrong in my understanding of what is behind the admiration that Dongfeng shows towards Ritchie and Dongfeng's critique of the substance and function approach. Through his actions, Ritchie significantly changed the otherwise inherently narcissistic character of the Christian mission in general and the Jesuit mission in particular. Perhaps we need more of Ritchie's openness and humility today. Whoever goes out to spread a gospel of any kind in the world should respect the strange people they encounter and avoid thinking that they are simply going over there to reclaim the house that should have been run according to some better rules all along. As for Dongfeng's harsh criticism of the partial hospitality approach based on variations of the substance and the function theory, the relevance of this to Chinese history from the 19th century down to present day cannot be more clear. At a time when complete rejection of foreign influences by a Middle Kingdom is no longer a plausible option and therefore probably doesn't carry much conviction, the ongoing iteration of the substance and function theory seems to deserve more serious attention. Here I suggest we hear a call for more courage, both intellectual and moral, with which the self could finally take some real risks with the stranger, willing to sustain sacrifices and no longer treating the stranger as a tool to the achievement of one's own end. I'd like to close with a couple of questions. First, Derrida, whom I would jokingly call Saint Derrida, given his central his centrality in Dongfeng's book. So Derrida advocates unconditional hospitality, which sounds like a literal take on the Spanish proverb, mi casa su casa, right? My house is your house. But I would just wonder, should there be any limits? What would happen when unconditional hospitality results in the guest taking over the house? Is it still your house? And secondly, in an inquiry about how friendship and hospitality can help create a better world, which, I see Dongfeng's book, to be fundamentally about. In such an inquiry, can we find any use for the old Chinese wisdom of 求同存异, seeking commonality and putting aside differences, and 和而不同, harmonious but not homogeneous? How is such wisdom different from recognizing and respecting the uniqueness and irreducible alterity of the friend as advocated by Levinas and Derrida? Could the relationships between the Jesuits and some Confucians serve as examples of these? For example, like Ye Xianggao and Kong Zhenshi, these people, they had very high appreciation for the Jesuits' knowledge, intelligence, and character, and they readily acknowledged on the basis of their interaction with the Jesuits, they readily acknowledged that China and Confucian classics were not the only origins of superior learning and wisdom, but At the same time, they simply did not believe that Christianity was superior to Confucianism, and they were not interested in becoming Christians. In other words, maybe I guess I can put my question this way. Besides the Confucian converts and the Confucian anti-Christians, is there a place for another category of Chinese in the Jesuit-Confucian encounter, that's so ably and illuminatingly studied by Dongfeng? Here are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ming-Bao.
Oh, sorry. I was muted. Let me just say thank you very much to Dr. Zhou for her eloquent and erudite comments. And at this point, we invite Dr. Wang Wensheng to deliver his discussion. And then afterwards, I invite Dr. Zhou back to the screen, and maybe the three of you can have a discussion and give Dr. Xu an opportunity to answer some of the questions. Okay.
Thank you, Ming-Bao. And thank you, Dongfeng, for your very stimulating presentation. It gave us a lot to think about, and I really enjoy reading your book. Welcome back to our CCS events. In the next 15 minutes or so, I will read several questions and share some of my very brief comments. First of all, Dongfeng's book opens up a new way of thinking about cross-cultural encounters, both in terms of research perspectives and methodology. When it comes to the Jesuit-Confucian encounter, we usually think of science and religion, which are the two predominant themes in the study of this topic. But this work focuses on friendship and hospitality, the two significant but understudied, underappreciated dimension in approaching the intellectual cultural exchange between China and Europe. This is an illuminating point of view because friendship is a human ideal common to Western and the Chinese traditions, which makes it a convenient bridge between East and West. As Matteo Ricci and his Chinese interlocutors saw it, the appreciation of friendship marks the beginning of learning by bringing together different people, different culture, and accommodating their diverse perspectives. So friendship is a useful starting point. It is a unifying basis and a model for cross-cultural dialogues, as Dongfeng puts it very well. It animates the activities of inter-civilizational exchange, which generates new understanding about both the other and the self. Secondly, this book provides a new postmodern reinterpretation of friendship and hospitality in late Ming encounter of Western learning. Over the past several decades, most China scholars of cross-cultural exchange tend to stress the China-centered process of reception and appropriation instead of the transmitter-oriented perspective of the West. This change reflects a paradigm shift from the classic Eurocentric to the Sinocentric perspective approach. At the same time, another intellectual trend has become more and more influential. Since the 1980s, postmodern theories like discourse analysis of Michel Foucault and the deconstruction theory of Jacques Derrida and others try to uncover the historical and the cultural relativity of knowledge, as well as the hidden agenda of power behind various discourses. And this book finds its theoretical apparatus mainly in the works of Levinas and Derrida, which emphasize deconstruction, anti-authority, and plurality. They examine friendship and hospitality as fluid concepts concerning alterity and open to difference or the other. While the traditional concept of friendship prefer the same to the other, Dongfeng attaches great importance to the irreducible difference of the other, taking it as the absolute condition of possibility under which friendship happens. My first question for Dongfeng is about methodology. How do you see the relationship between these two methodological preferences I just mentioned, postmodernism and Sinocentric studies, in your own research? You seem to rely greatly on the postmodern series of Derrida and Levinas, and this approach is certainly important and refreshing, but placing too much emphasis on it might also make your book a little controversial. Some scholars would say postmodern series are great, but how are they relevant? They are rooted in the Western post-industrial society. How were they relevant for the study of traditional Chinese empire and its engagement with the outside world? Instead, from their perspective, it is more important to examine how the Chinese practice science, religion, and philosophy on their own terms, in their own context, and for their own needs while interacting with their Western counterparts. What do you think of this kind of skepticism? Interestingly, as I see it, to some extent, you and Richie are taking up a similar challenge. That is, how to make Western-derived categories, ideas, and approach palatable to the reader of Chinese history and Chinese culture. Other important examples include the public sphere and the civil society, etc., whether they are useful or appropriate for the study of traditional China. To meet this challenge, I think it would be helpful to ground postmodern analysis in a more historicized and comprehensive setting of Sino-Western interactions. This more complicated setting is important because cross-cultural encounters are shaped by the complex interplay of a wide range of factors and actors on different spatial and temporal levels. Far from predetermined, many of those encounters seem like a trial and error process of contested appropriation and accommodation dictated by different personal agendas, changing social political circumstances, involving intellectual currents, as well as shifting balance of global power. And this book does a great job in highlighting a series of tensions, dilemmas in the Jesuit-Confucian encounters. They showcase a complicated approach of cultural adaptation, contestation, and appropriation as both sides try to incorporate the other into their own tradition by offering new interpretation of each other, the self and the other. Take Matteo Ricci as an example, the de facto founder of the Catholic China mission. Dongfeng focuses on two of his most important intellectual productions, his book, his treatise on friendship, Jiao You Lun, as well as his map of the world. To make sense of these two achievements, it's necessary to understand the social, cultural, political crises of late Ming, the intellectual context of Renaissance humanism and the church struggle in Europe, the geopolitical context of Spanish and Portuguese imperial ambitions in Asia Pacific, as well as the intense controversies over evangelism and imperial expansion that divided missionaries abroad. In the late 16th century, there were bitter contexts over missionary methods for the Christianization of Asia, especially China, within Catholic Church. Situated in this kind of deep, multifaceted context, Ricci's Treaty on Friendship may be seen as a sensible alternative to the projects of European imperial expansion that was much discussed and often threatened and implemented at that time. Major examples include the Spanish conquest of the New World and the Philippines around this time. As for the map of the world, Ricci knew very well that China maintained a deep sensitivity to foreign intrusion. To some extent, this map sought to reduce the Chinese fear of foreigners, Westerners, by confirming that Europe and China are separated by a huge body of water and other natural barriers, which made any attack by Western powers very difficult, if not impossible. So postmodern analysis, albeit very useful, by itself cannot do justice to the great complexity of the East-West encounters. It needs to be supplemented with deep contextualization and in-depth interpretation of the Jesuits' actual lived experience and the manifold activities on the ground. Back to Ritchie. We should take him as not only a general symbol of East-West exchange, but also a flesh and blood human being struggling in faraway foreign land, facing all kinds of pressure from both Chinese and church authorities, as well as from hostile conservative Confucian elites and his fellow missionary colleagues. He was sandwiched by so many pressures. We can feel his agonizing pain by reading his journal, which also help us understand how important for him to cultivate friendship in the Middle Kingdom. We need to look at him on a more personal level by examining his relationship with his many friends and allies during his long career in China. What did he think of those friends? How to assess his personal feelings toward the kinds of friendship he had experienced in China? Those questions are important because whatever success Ritchie had achieved in the Ming Dynasty, it was closely related to his actual network of friends in his host country. We need to also understand his signature strategy of accommodation, which you and Yiqun has talked very eloquently about. Shortly after his arrival in China, Ritchie realized that he was confronted with a highly developed, advanced, and self-contained cultural system, a really tough nut to crack, in his words. To gain a foothold in this vast empire, he had no choice but to adopt a very pragmatic strategy of indirect proselytization, which the Vatican tolerated until the late 18th century, the Rights Controversy. Specifically, he sought to make his Christian message more palatable to the Chinese taste by repackaging it in Confucian colors. To further strengthen its appeal, he associated with both Chinese emphasis on humanistic concern and the moral cultivation, as well as Western humanism and their achievements in pragmatic sciences like mathematics and astronomy. Not surprisingly, he wrote his first book in China on friendship, a topic both Confucian literati and European humanists had long been interested in, especially in the late 16th century. There was a revival of interest on the topic of friendship. In China, that's related to factionalism and the rise of the Dongfeng Academy. That's the Chinese side of the story. Later, Ritchie made his map of the world, the first map of its kind prepared in Chinese, which both confirmed and challenged Chinese traditional cosmology, as Dongfeng mentioned. He also collaborated with Xu Guangqi, the most famous of all Chinese Christian converts, in translating the first 6 books of Euclid's classical mathematical work, Elements of Geometry, 几何原本. Those important activities were part of the experimentation of Ritchie's accommodation policy, as he tried very hard to search for the best way to attract the literati to his Christian message. First, focus on humanistic issues, philosophical issues like friendship, hospitality, and cosmology. Then he focused on pragmatic science, quantifying science, like cartography, mathematics, and astronomy. Ritchie did all this because he hoped to accommodate the Chinese view and Chinese interest while appealing to China's Confucian statecraft tradition, even if it means he had to put his Christian message to the back seat. By the way, in his 100 Western sayings, in his 教育论, only 2 sayings mention God. So he worked so hard to conceal his Christian message. In so doing, he hoped to bring together the shared values between Chinese and European cultures and knowledge systems by downplaying their differences and highlighting common endeavors. He wanted to persuade the Ming literati that Christianity could be assimilated into Chinese learning and vice versa. This book covers a range of important topics, including humanism, philosophy, literature, theology, and science. All of them are crucial ways of representing and conceptualizing the world, which are tied together in the long march of human civilization. So it's important to understand the relationship to each other, which is a gigantic and very complicated question, to be sure. Before the scientific revolution, the lines, the boundaries between those different domains were pretty blurry. But as scientists started to contradict the religious doctrine, the divide between science, religion, and other domains grew. So Western learning itself is a moving target. So is the Chinese and the European conception of it. We need to think about what constitutes Western learning in the eyes of educated elites in both late Imperial China and early modern Europe. Moreover, how to understand the relative status and the relative role of those different domains. Of course, the situation varies greatly from place to place and from time to time, which demand specific and close treatment. And Dongfeng's book helps us a lot in understanding those important questions. Okay, I will stop here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang's insightful and thought-provoking questions. So at this point, I invite Dr. Zhou to join us. And I would suggest that to give Dr. Xu a couple of minutes to maybe respond to one or two, points raised by the respondents. Obviously, if you wanted to respond to everything, we need another 2 hours. We also invite audience to post their questions using the Q&A tool. But let's give Dr. Xu first an opportunity to respond to Dr. Wang and Dr. Zhou's very insightful, illuminating comments.
Well, my heartfelt thanks to both Yiqun and Wensheng for your erudite, thoughtful, and stimulating comments. And I think I learned a great deal. First, Yiqun's question about this Saint Derrida. Well, if we know how he answered the question or explained the statement he made, unconditional hospitality, we may not call him saint anymore, because after repeatedly arguing for unconditional hospitality, making it the only kind of hospitality we should have, then he came to his limit, I think. He admitted this kind of hospitality, the practicality of this kind of hospitality, unconditional, is a little bit of a problem. Because from his perspective, unconditional hospitality means every time you open your door and welcome someone to come into your house, you should be ready to lose your house at the same time, because you are not welcoming someone. Because if you are welcoming, that's partial hospitality from his theory, at least, because you are declaring or you are making clear who is the host, because a guest will not welcome the host, right? When you come to the host door, you can only be invited to go in. You have to ask, may I come in? Or should I take off my shoes? What, some of the rules you have, I have to, go by. So he did acknowledge that. And also this is a little bit of a problem here, because when Levinas talk about hospitality, talk about the condition for hospitality to take place, he very specifically and clearly said, you have to have 4 walls in order to have hospitality, because otherwise, how can you do that? So, or you belong to a country, you are a citizen of a certain country, you may be able to say that, but still you have to have this kind of, some kind of possession before you do that. So for unconditional hospitality, I think it's theoretically, it is something which is, well, it is something we should strive for. But in reality, I'm not sure, because when you have unconditional hospitality, you can do it only once. But the first guest coming in, taking over, what are you going to do? You won't be a host anymore. You won't be able to practice hospitality. Of course, for Derrida, hospitality does not really mean you have to have a house to be a host, because as a self, how we remain open to others' opinion, to otherness, just to the existence of otherness, that is hospitality already. Okay. So you remain open. I guess that's the idea, and that's the minimum. The conditional, unconditional hospitality maybe here. I'm not sure. And to your second question, yeah, that's well, maybe the second, maybe how do we make this world a better world? Do we have unconditional hospitality all the time? Can we really do that? Or do we, as you said, use the Chinese phrase, 求同存异 or 和而不同? Well, these are the questions from Confucius times, so we are still trying to answer it. And I think that's, I don't know if I don't think I have a good answer here. But maybe we can open, when we open the floor, we can hear from from the audience what is the best way. I don't know. Nowadays, look at the relationship between the U.S. and China. What's going on? Are we, trying to eliminate the difference, or are we welcoming the difference, or are we regard the difference as threat or risk, things like that? So I don't know. I mean, but it's maybe it's time for us all to put our heads together and come up with a solution, not just for the future of the world, maybe for the presence of the world. Yeah.
That gave us another reason to read your wonderful book, to solve international conflict. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. Great, and it's a question which has immediacy. It's not just a theoretical speculation. What we can do if the world becomes like this or that, or life goes to a certain, reaches certain stage. But it is everyday life. So that's why I always say the whatever is in ancient time, like the old concepts of friendship and hospitality, as Wensheng mentioned, it's a friendship, hospitality, same. It's a most fundamental part of human relationship. We talk about that, we practice that every day, and but we need to stop and think about that, and then maybe we can. How do you say? I wouldn't want to say better way to do that, but maybe see some other possibilities there. And
I guess I was wondering, because in your book, from beginning to end, you made such good use of Levinas and Derrida. So I guess my question was actually wondering, given the existence of, such conventional Chinese wisdom, about how to handle difference and sameness, right? 和而不同, it's not going for sameness, it's just like harmony implies the coexistence of different things, right? So I'm just wondering, given the existence of such conventional Chinese wisdom, I'm just like, is there a way, that we, invoke both the Western saints and the Chinese saints in your noble pursuit? Yeah, but obviously, I'm not trying to press you for an answer. The answer would not be forthcoming. But it's wondering the approach thing. Probably also somewhat echoing what Wensheng asking about. It's like China-centered approach, or where the inspiration comes from. That's my underlying question. I guess I think I'm done. I'm done with my questions.
I think Yiqun has a great point by mentioning the 求同存异 and 和而不同. I saw great commonalities between what Dongfeng emphasized about the importance of friendship. The key point is not to eliminate difference. For example, 和而不同, harmony in diversity. So in order to achieve harmony, we have to admit the difference between things, right? So it's not about making you exactly like me, like conventional, traditional understanding of friendship is. You foster friendship by emphasizing similarities. So I think great similarities and great contemporary implications about a riches approach, accommodation. We need more accommodation in this age of new Cold War, right? Is a new accommodation possible in this 21st century, right? Why 17th century is so important? It is called the Jesuit age. It is the only period in Chinese history that both sides of the encounters, China and Europe, they achieve a major period of a compromise and accommodation. There's no other period in Chinese history we can see so much accommodation. And this is good for both sides in terms of cultural exchange and material benefits. Later, the Jesuit Catholic Church, the Pope hardened its approach toward China. They demand the Chinese follow the order of the Pope and the Vatican, which infuriated the Kangxi Emperor, which led to this cold period between in Jesuit mission, and also led to this rights controversy, eventually ended the Jesuit China mission in 1780s. And it was not brought back until 41 years later. So we can learn from those historical lessons and strive for more similarities, but also keep our differences, right? So it's not only, this book is not only useful for interpersonal relations, it is useful for diplomatic and great power politics.
Okay. I hate to interrupt this exciting dialogue and these profound thoughts, but we have actually two anonymous questions from the audience, and I'm going to put in the first one in the chat so our audience can follow along. And I think there are some grammatical errors, so I take the liberty to correct it, right? The first one, I think all three of you could probably answer it. The Jesuits reduced the meaning or understanding of friendship to pagan friendship in order to evangelize. But is it that the final goal was to reach their standard of Christian charity eventually? I heard that the Jesuits even learned not only Chinese language, but also dress in official Chinese dress. To avoid the difference, to reach the agreement of their beliefs of virtue and quality. So I think maybe any of you since you're so knowledgeable about the subject, maybe you want to respond to that. So that's the first one. We have another anonymous question. Anyone? Maybe Dongfeng, you want to take it first? Or
can you quickly summarize the question again?
I'll put it in the chat as well. You can also look. The Jesuits reduced the meaning or understanding of friendship to pagan friendship in order to evangelize. But is it that the final goal was to reach the standard of Christian charity eventually? And then a comment from this person: I heard that the Jesuits even learned not only Chinese language, but also dress in official Chinese dress to avoid the differences, to reach the agreement of their belief and virtue and qualities.
Yeah, I will say very quickly and very simply. I think this is a very interesting question. They reduce, they dress up like Chinese, they learn Chinese language, they learn many other things. And, but it's not that they gave themselves up to differences, I think, because the Jesuit principle or the guideline for the Jesuit, the order, Jesuit order is everything to serve theology. So their ultimate goal is theology, or is God, or is conversion. And there was a reason they had to go to China at the time. Wensheng mentioned that it was an important time. And also it was a time following the separation of the church after the Reformation. And the church was separated already forever. They realized that. So they don't have monopoly in Europe anymore. It was time they turn around or turn in a different direction, say, let's go out, let's do something else to Asia, to Latin America. So but no matter what they did in the country they went, they were not there to become the others. They are there to eventually convert, and they could do anything. Because one very famous motto for the Jesuit was, let's become Chinese to win China for Christ. So they didn't mind to be living like the Chinese, but their ultimate goal is not really to be part of the Chinese. So that's why I would say their purpose or the mission is to assimilate, not to. But the problem I found was when they were doing that for their ultimate goal, they had to take indirect ways to do that. Why? Exactly because they couldn't overcome the kind of differences they found, and they wanted to assimilate. So I think that's my quick answer. I don't know if I answered it. So
anybody, Wensheng or Yiqun, do you want to add something to that? Otherwise, we go to the second question. Right? Okay, the second question. The second question. Let me read it. It's in the chat form, so you can read it, right? Chinese is again by an anonymous. Chinese indeed accepted the Jesuits' preach because they were touched by their charity and hospitality, although they went through big conflicts of religious beliefs and Confucius' ancestors' ritual tradition. Thus, is this proof that Christian charity and hospitality works towards the Chinese or for the Chinese? I do not think that the Vatican changed the moral standards to fit Chinese taste, but clarified the motivation and nature of certain Chinese traditional practices, whether in the religious comments. Well, there's some grammatical errors in the second sentence, so I'm not quite sure, but maybe you could just address the first part. The Chinese accepted the Jesuits' preach because they were touched by their charity and hospitality, although they went through big conflicts of religious beliefs and Confucius' ancestors' ritual tradition. Thus, is this proof that their Christian charity and hospitality works towards the Chinese? I guess it's very similar to the first one, right? To the question you just answered. Mm-hmm.
Well, can I very quickly say, this is a very complicated, it's a very interesting question, and the rights controversy caused a lot of trouble in China and in the Catholic Church. So that's why eventually the Jesuit order was disbanded for a long time, and the mission to China was set back because the church at the time, they determined ancestral worship in China was a religious act, and you can't, as a convert, you can't really worship your ancestors and at the same time believe in God. So caused a lot of problems. And then in 1960s, the church issued another edict saying, well, I mean, we will allow Chinese converts to worship, to be part of the ancestral worship and to offer sacrifices. But whether or not Chinese practice or the practice of ancestral worship, sacrifice, they are religious or not, should not be determined by the Pope, right? I mean, when he says it is, you can't do that. When they say it is okay to do that, that means it's not a religious practice anymore. Yeah, I just want to say about this. I mean, it's very interesting. And for Ritchie, he sometimes says China has no religion, and Chinese, they don't have a God. And in the writing I did, I haven't published it yet. But for the Chinese, he says, hey, you do have gods. You know, you have the term Lord on high, 上帝, in your Confucian classics. At the time, he didn't see the oracle bone inscriptions because they are full of God all the time, everywhere. And he didn't say, but he digged out those that term from Confucian classics in Shangshu, book of documents, and also a book of poetry. He used that term to translate the Christian name of God, Deus, into Chinese. So he had two terms to translate the name of God. One is Lord of Heaven, and the other is Lord on high, 上帝. He used 上帝. And it led eventually to the fact, nowadays, when Chinese utter the term 上帝, the first deity you think is the Christian God, not the gods you saw in Confucian classics. So that's the influence of his translation. Very interesting. But in Europe, so lots of people, when his journal diary became so popular, lots of people believe China had no religion because of him, because he was telling. Because if you say the Confucians or Confucianism is religious, how can you befriend them? The first thing you should do is to fight them. So he had to justify himself and saying, oh, Confucianism is a school of philosophy, it's not religious. But nowadays, of course, if Confucianism is religious or not, is open to discussion, but it does have lots of religious practice there, rituals, ancestral worship, sacrifice, things like that.
All right.
I'd like to
Wensheng, of course, go ahead.
add a few points about that. Yeah. I think most Chinese Christian converts, including the most famous one, Xu Guangqi, they accepted Jesuits' preach not because they were touched by their charity and hospitality. It's because they deemed the Western knowledge, especially the exact science like astronomy, mathematics, cartography, was useful for Chinese state and society in a state of crisis like late Ming, okay? And they want to make it a part of the Chinese knowledge system. So a fascinating part of your book, Dongfeng, is about the Xu Xue Zhongyuan, the Chinese origin of Western science, Western learning. This is a fascinating example to show the great assimilating power of the Chinese cultural and intellectual tradition. They claim that all the great inventions eventually come from China, because during the Qin dynasty, there is a Fenshu Kenru. I'm sure a lot of our audience know this event. And because of this great fire in the Fenshu Kenru, a lot of wonderful scientific works were spread out to the West. It's called westward diffusion of Chinese knowledge. And Westerners picked it up, elaborate on it, improve on it, and then reintroduce them back to China. So feel free to adopt it and don't worry about it. That's the Chinese way of, assimilating the foreign culture. So that's the reason we have to understand Chinese history on Chinese terms. The China Sinocentric approach is very important here. And I also want to emphasize that traditionally people think that China is a closed country, conservative, but as a matter of fact, throughout Chinese history, Chinese emperors, Chinese governments and officials has been enthusiastically embracing, engage the outside world, encouraging, seeking the circulation of foreign ideas and foreign goods. At the same time, there is a great dilemma. Those in authority, means the emperor and his high officials, they have been consistently reluctant to allow free rein to any kind of foreign ideology, because they worry about lose political and moral control over their own people. So when the Pope insisted that Chinese Christians cannot do ancestral worship and worship of Confucius, this is a no for Chinese government and for the Kangxi emperor. And this almost killed the Jesuit China mission. It eventually killed it. And so as it is still the case nowadays, the Chinese government is very careful about the information. They have the censorship of the internet, and they have troubled relationship with the Vatican. All this is related to the dilemma I just mentioned. They don't want a foreign institution or foreign leader have authority over their own people within their jurisdiction. So we have to keep this in mind when we understand any major Sino-Western encounters, even today.
Thank you, Wensheng, for providing this great summary and insightful comments. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. But before we close today's session, let me thank our three speakers today for joining our CCS webinar and for their very lively, inspiring and dialogue and erudite comments and questions. To our audience, many thanks for your attendance and comments. And please remember to fill out the survey. Last but not least, our next CCS webinar is actually on Friday, February 24th. And we have to do it on Friday because we have people attending from China. So we start also at 2 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock. And it will be a faculty roundtable entitled Cooperation Between Chinese and American Universities in the New Geopolitical Context. So I think what you've learned today about friendship and hospitality will also be relevant for this panel. The moderator is our very own Dr. Baoyan Teng from UH College of Education, who is a specialist on comparative international education. And speakers include Dr. Zhou Qiang from York University in Canada, Dr. Simon Wu from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Dr. Wu Hantian from Zhejiang University. Co-sponsors are the UHM Department of Educational Foundation. So thank you very much, everyone. And please join me in thanking our speakers today. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a great discussion.